which is a home equity tax. Is a home equity tax in the future for Canada? This story is I saw this kind of a picture of this post on Twitter once again, and this is from a think tank. So a think tank, if you guys don't know what that is, it's like a company or it's like an organization that thinks of ideas for how like politics, where politics should go, or what kind of policies the government should implement, and all these like ideas for the future, right? So this one is from a think tank called Generational Squeeze, right here in Canada, and I think I would describe this as more of a left leaning think tank, right? Not to be like partisan, but I'm just like, calling a spade, right? It's like a left biased think tank. And what Generational Squeeze has suggested was that, hey, like only 10% of Canadians live in homes over $1 million. So maybe it's like a good idea to tax home equity, right? So how this would work is that if your house is over $1 million, there will be a surtax applied to you, and it would kind of curtail like people who just sit in their houses and do nothing and wait for their house price to go up, which is how honestly a lot of people here in Canada kind of got rich, right? They bought a house way back in the day and it's gone up so much, and basically they could just retire and never have to work again. However, you guys know me. I'm more of maybe a I guess you can say a libertarian type of person. So I'm very wary of different taxes and different ideas for taxing the rich and all this stuff. But I welcome debate and I welcome new ideas. So before I impart my opinion, what do you guys think? Right? Do you guys like just based off of the top of your head? Right. I know you guys have experience in economics and topics in, taxation and all this stuff. Right. So just off the top of your head, what do you guys think, like, of this idea of a surtax on home equity? And yeah, like, do you think this will work? Do you think this will make things better? Or do you think this will make things worse? Or just your opinions on something like this in general?
Here, I'll chime in this time. Okay, so I think it could be good and bad. So like the good would be it would like allow, foreign investors to like invest less into the Canadian market. So I guess that kind of could be beneficial like in the short term. But I think in the long term, if something like this were to happen, um homes over $1 million are typically owned by people who have like really high skills and like high professions and stuff like that. So if you're eliminating that specific group of people, you're giving people less of a reason to want to stay in Canada. Like, let's say, for example, you're a doctor making a high salary who could afford and want that $1 million home. You're not going to want to stay in Canada because why would you want to get extra taxes when you could literally just go to the States, earn a better dollar and not have to deal with this tax on taxation, like maybe considerably BS situation that you would put yourself in. So if this happens, there's even more of a reason as to why highly skilled, um, like employees or workers of society would just leave Canada to go to the States or go elsewhere, which is kind of what's happening right now. So that's definitely the con. But I guess it could be good for the load of foreign investors that are seeing this and like go like, oh no, maybe I don't want to buy anymore, and that could maybe affect the housing market positively. But I could see this more as a con. More Canadians would just leave Canada, and overall, I don't think that's a good thing. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think this perspective is very questionable in my opinion, just because um they're saying live in homes over $1 million. Um I don't want to be that guy, but basically every house in Toronto is over $1 million. So are we basically just talking about taxing anyone who bought a house in the last 50 years in Toronto for and have a house that's now worth $1 million because they did nothing. And also, to clarify, just because you have $1 million house does not mean you have $1 million. Like, you can very easily be very house poor when that you own a very valuable piece of property, but you don't have a way to access that money because you have to live in your house. So you can't sell your house to move somewhere else because you live in your house. So how do you get that $1 million? If they start this tax, you're now having to maybe you don't have enough money to cover that tax amount. So now are we expecting people to go into debt to afford their house? And I understand that going into debt as someone who owns an asset is not as bad as going into debt as someone who doesn't own an asset. But it's still just like, just because you have $1 million house does not mean you have $1 million. And it doesn't mean that you're like functionally a millionaire, particularly in a country like Canada where our housing has inflated so much for no real good reason. And thousands of houses that shouldn't be worth $1 million are worth $1 million. So I don't see how this perspective, because like at a glance, if you look at this with like blurred vision without like thinking about it too carefully, you'd be like, oh yeah, those guys in mansions should be paying more because like you don't need to live in a mansion. But then like when you think about it, like you go to like North York in Toronto, you find a 3-bedroom 1,000-square-foot house. That shit's worth $1 million. So now you're taxing the family that bought that 20 years ago that hasn't moved. You're taxing them at the same time that you're taxing the mansion. Is the person who lives in the 3-bedroom 1,000-square-foot house as rich as someone who lives in a mansion? Is that what you think of when you think of rich? Like that doesn't really jive with me like that. And that is people's like nest egg. And I understand that housing shouldn't be an investment, but financial education was not taught to people growing up, which means that most people have one nest egg and one nest egg alone, and that is a property that they have equity in. And so you start taxing that, and we may end up with even more poor people because you take a house poor person and you tax them. They're not going to have a ton of money and to cover it necessarily. And it's just like just because you have a very valuable asset does not mean that you have a lot of liquid money. I feel like that is just a point that I really need to drive home. I can own $1 million in property and still make only $30,000 a year annually. Yeah, I have an asset, but I make $30,000 a year. I can afford my groceries and my car. That's about it.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. And this, I think, is a really critical flaw of the left, especially here in Canada, where when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So the left leaning, again, not to be partisan, but I'm just calling it as I see it, right? The left leaning factions of this country is so willing to bring out the tax hammer and hit you with it as soon as you cross some magical threshold where you cross into the rich kind of class. And I think that this kind of thinking is just completely wrong. So Dom, you brought up earlier how this could discourage foreign investors into the Canadian real estate market. And I get where you're coming from, but let me toss a question to you actually. Like, why should we do that, right? Why should we discourage foreign investors into our real estate market? Well, obviously the answer you would say, well, like there's only so much real estate to go around, and if the foreigners come in and they buy up housing, it drives up housing prices for everyone, right? Well, again, this is a supply and demand issue, right? This is only the case because we're not building enough housing. So ideally, if coming in and investing a lot into our market, that money goes into the Canadian economy, right? So if they don't come, then we don't get their money. So uh, this is the kind of the point I want to drive home, is that we shouldn't be fighting over the scraps, right? So right now we're kind of having this mentality of pitting people against people, right? So it's like the people, the Canadian native born citizens versus the foreign investors, or it's the, middle class people, the young people who are trying to buy their first house, uh, versus the boomers who bought their house in Toronto 50 years ago, or it's, it's the people with the $500,000 house versus the people with the $1 million house, or it's the renters versus the people who have $1 million houses. Like it's class warfare, right? We're having like this open class warfare, and this is just incredibly unhealthy. So what I'm suggesting, instead of just bringing out the tax hammer and hitting people with it, why don't we just solve the supply issue at their core, right? This is like, we just literally need to build more housing. Like this, I don't know how many different ways I can talk about this, but we just need to build more housing, right? And having a tax, a home equity tax, it doesn't really help, because you're just you're just putting a damper on like economic growth, and you're putting a damper on everything. So I remember back in like when I was younger, right? I think I'm still relatively young, but when I was, let's say, a teenager, $1 million seemed like so much money, right? If you had $1 million, then of course you're rich. How could you not be rich? Honestly, if you were to ask me right now, having like $1 million home, it doesn't even make you like rich in my mind, right? Maybe like you guys would disagree with that, or maybe some of our audience members would disagree with that. But like, and again, I'm coming from a perspective of not being a real estate owner, right? So to be clear, I don't own any real estate myself. So, and I certainly don't own any real estate that's $1 million or more. So I'm speaking from the perspective of like a non-real estate owner, that I think that this like surtax, this home equity tax idea, is a really, really bad idea, because like it's just $1 million is already not like a very high threshold. And with inflation, that's just going to get like the threshold is going to come down, because like, it's like if you own a home that's worth 1 million Venezuelan bolivars in 2008, that means something very different than owning something worth 1 million Venezuelan bolivars in 2024, right? Like if you look at the inflation rate of the Venezuelan bolivar, I'm not saying that the Canadian dollar is going to hyperinflate, but I'm just trying to take an extreme example and make a point where we set the threshold at $1 million, right? And you say, okay, only 10% of Canadians they own a home that's worth 10 million, that's worth $1 million. Well, if you fast forward like 5 years or fast forward 10 years, then maybe like everyone will own a home that's worth at least $1 million. And not because everyone is rich, but because like our dollar has inflated so much that like, a loaf of bread now costs $100, right? Like that could happen, right? I'm not like saying that that's what's going to happen for sure, but that is a possibility, right? So we got to think about these, like the effect of these tax policies. And as Tristan said, a lot of people are house poor, right? So they might own a home with $1 million that's worth $1 million, but not all of that equity is spendable. And like, what are you going to do? Ask like boomers to take a reverse mortgage and like, so that they can pay this tax? Do you think they'll be happy about it? Right. And it's just like, we're just fighting over the scraps instead of trying to increase the size of the pie for everyone. And this is not what our country needs right now, and not what our country needs in the future, in my opinion. So yeah, Tristan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I also want to jump in here and say something about the fact that if just because you have $1 million home also doesn't mean that you own the $1 million home. I feel like I kind of zeroed in on boomers who own the home more or less outright, that's just appreciated a lot. But anyone who's buying a house in Toronto, period, right now is buying $1 million house, whether they can afford it or not. So if you're someone who's, worked really hard and saved up, somehow managed to make a down payment, and now you've got $800,000 of debt on a $1 million house, and then you're now getting taxed on it, like your mortgage payments already at that point are going to be massive. So the fact that it doesn't even specify like whether or not those individuals would be people who own their house outright or anything like that, I just feel like you're going to squeeze people who are even more squeezed. And like, let's say for example, you bought a house in Toronto for like $500,000. It's now appreciated to $1 million, but you've only paid off like $40,000 or $50,000, right? You still have $450,000 to pay off on this house. So it's not like you've just got all this money lying around because of your home is worth $1 million. You're still paying a monthly mortgage that's probably similarly a similar price to a lot of the rent in Toronto. And so in that regard, it's just like, how is this a solution other than like me kind of, hazing my eyes and going, that seems like a good idea, like hits blunt kind of kind of mentality, like that seems like it might work, make the rich dudes pay more. Like, it just doesn't seem in practice like it would be very effective.
Yeah, and also I don't remember reading this in the article, but I think that it's implied that this surtax will go towards investing in building housing and all that stuff. At least I think that's what they're trying to get at. But let me just mention that I don't think they explicitly mentioned what the tax is exactly going to be used for, right? So if this idea, let's say it gets implemented, and then the government collects a bunch of these like home equity tax dollars. If we don't specify that they're going to spend this money on building housing projects, then doesn't that mean that they could technically take this money and spend it on wherever they want, right? Like we talked about, like a bunch of kind of, in my opinion, things that the liberal government right now is kind of spending on that's not exactly very like helpful or the best way to spend the money, like i.e. the budget where they said they were going to spend $2 billion on investing in AI, which there's already a lot of investment in AI in the private sector. I don't see why the government should really get into that, right? So if, let's say, it's still the liberals that are in charge when if and when this tax gets implemented, then what's to stop them from being like, hey, like we just collected a bunch of this surtax from the home equity tax. Why not just just spend it on AI, or we'll give it back to you in like a home equity rebate or whatever, right? So like it's just as I said, like it's not the best way to really conduct things if they don't also spend this tax dollars in the most efficient way, which I have doubts that they like will be able to. And I think that the whole point of this like idea that is presented in this article, it's funny how they like hashtagged it housing solutions, because it's not directly implied on how it's going to exactly help like housing. Again, I think, like as Dom was mentioning, it's going to drive away like people from Canada, right? Like if you're a doctor or something, you chances are you're like living in your income can afford you a house that's over $1 million. Then like you're getting hit with this tax and that tax already, and like we talked about the capital gains tax increase, right? You're getting hit with that, and then now if you're getting hit with a home equity tax, you might just decide, hey, like why don't I just go to America, right? And I think that that's like something that's like it's not the best solution, obviously, in case I haven't made that clear. And I really do think that this idea of this home equity tax, the only reason why they mentioned it or they brought this idea up is a punitive tax to punish people for being rich. Like they don't care about the tax dollars that they're collecting. They're not gonna like, they didn't specify exactly what we're gonna do with this money. That's not the point. The point is just to punish you for being rich because your house went up in value, right? Like I kind of just, that's the sense that I got. And it's like, it's like something that you do out of spite and out of anger. And it's like, it's something that people do when they're not thinking logically, right? They're just using an emotional response. At least that's the sense that I got. But I don't know if you guys, probably a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but that's just kind of the sense that I got. So what do you guys think? Do you guys think that, like, do you agree with what I just said, or do you disagree?
I could see it being more of a punishment. The way it's phrased, it kind of feels like it's more so a little bit of a punishment. Like, your house is worth $1 million. You got that housing privilege. You should be contributing to the poor folks so that they could get their own houses. And it would help disrupt the Canada's addiction to high and rising home values. And wealthy homeowners need to gain from raising prices while they sleep and watch TV. Like, that's all sounds very very aggressive and against the homeowners. It very much sounds like a angry man shouts at homeowners instead of clouds, rather than trying to figure out how to get it so that they themselves are also in a financially better position, so that they can be one of the people who has a home that they can afford, right? And another thing that I also just want to comment on, that's not quite what you were talking about before, but I also just don't know how this would work with like stuff that is kind of like a home and a business at the same time. So for example, like say you bought a farm. Most farms come with house, but the farm itself might be worth a lot of money. Is the farm going to be taxed also? Is the house value going to be taxed? How are you determining the house value of that farm? Are you because if you're doing like a farm with a whole bunch of like farming like barns and stuff, like you can easily get the value of that property up into the tens of millions of dollars, but it's basically just a business. So are they proposing to tax that in a similar mentality as a normal house that's worth $1 million? Like, it just, like, it doesn't seem, it very much seems like a if you haze your eyes a little bit and like are like, how am I gonna fix the housing crisis? Just gonna, what if we taxed $1 million houses? They shouldn't be $1 million anyway. It very much just feels like that is all it is. It's like, oh, they shouldn't be getting all this money from rising home prices while they sleep and watch TV. And I feel like someone needs to tell them that unrealized gains are unrealized, as in the person doesn't have the money. And if all the houses go up to $1 million and you have a house that's worth $1 million, guess what? You have basically no real value because you have to live somewhere. If you sell your house, now you have to buy a new house. How their house is still $1 million. If every house is $1 million, you have no way to actually use that money to improve your life. So it's like, I don't know. They definitely. It's very much like complete lack of understanding of basic economics is kind of it really feels like to me.
Yeah, I mean, to maybe go back to your earlier point, I believe that the implication here is that it will only apply to residential real estate. So I believe there is already legislation that is in place right now that gives tax benefits and property tax benefits to farms and stuff. So if you're actually using the land for something productive, then you're exempt from a lot of property tax, or you pay like very little property tax for your farm. So I don't think that to be fair to them, I don't think they're suggesting that if you have a farm, it should also be like taxed for the equity. But yeah, again, like that doesn't really make it that much better, like you said, because I just think this is like, yeah, it's a dumb idea, right? Like you're taxing, as you said, unrealized gains. It's like, I look at my stock portfolio every day, and like I'm not gonna buy or sell my like Bitcoin or Bitcoin miners, which goes up and down a lot, like on a frequent basis, right? So if I try to like, buy and sell, like if I try to day trade and actually like realize my like profits and losses, like chances are like I'll actually lose a lot of money over time. And even if I don't, then it's like very volatile, and like, it's just not something that I would do, right? But that means that if, let's say, my Bitcoin miners, like let's say if Bitfarms just like doubles the next day, until I sell, it doesn't actually make my life any better, right? Like I don't actually get to use any of the money until I sell. So the idea that you should tax someone just for their unrealized gains, that's another really, really stupid idea that is being championed by, again, the left. Not to be partisan, I'm just calling it as I see it, right? A lot of these like, tax hammer, like the ban hammer is, instead of the ban hammer, it's the tax hammer. And that's just like the only tool that the left likes to use. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be any taxes at all whatsoever, although maybe some libertarians would actually argue that. But I'm not going to go that far and say that every tax should be eliminated. But I'm just saying we should be very, very careful as to what kind of situations we want to use the tax hammer on. So that's the point that I was kind of trying to drive home.